Welcome to the first ever Reboot America Summit. We have, I know a lot of people still kind of filtering in from the atrium and getting breakfast, but we've got a really packed day and we're already starting 15 minutes late, so wanted to kick things off. So thank you all for coming, particularly since I'm not sure a lot of people necessarily know right off the bat what a Reboot Summit is supposed to be. And it's pretty simple. We're here today to talk about solutions, and we're here to talk about big, crazy, radical, disruptive, innovative solutions to the big problems that our country is facing. A lot of what we're trying to accomplish today is to start to build a new community, to bring together people that are all trying to work on a lot of these problems, but they're trying to work on them from their own perspective, in their own way, from a corporate lens, from a startup lens, from a policy lens, and start building new relationships and new connective tissue here in the region, but more broadly, across the country. And before I get into introducing our first panel or talking a little bit more about some of the challenges we want to talk about today, I want to really introduce and thank the people that have sort of made this possible, not simply because it's important to thank people, but because it's indicative of the kinds of relationships that have already been built through what we're trying to do and that we hope to continue to foster going forward. So to start out with, we've had a tremendously compelling organizing and host committee. And so I really want to thank Mark Drapo from Microsoft, Lisa Throckmorton from Speakerbox, Peter Cherukuri from Huffington Post, Kim Hart-Johnson from Newstar, Nathan Daschle from Ruckus, Roy Schroitz from Politico, Brandon Pollock from Brian Cave, Alessandra Caruzza from AM Global, Donna Harris from Startup America, Alexa Raducanu from Opower, Blake Hall from TroopSwap, Alex Howard from O'Reilly Media, Frank DiGiamarino from Amazon, and Anish Chopra, the former Chief Technology Officer of the United States and current candidate for Lieutenant Governor of the state of Commonwealth of Virginia. So, when I say talking about solutions, right, we want to put that in the lens of what's already happened this week, right? We, in case you hadn't been paying attention for the last several months, we had a bit of an election, right? We spent $6 billion and basically brought back essentially the same set of circumstances we had before. We have the same president, we have a Democratic Senate, and we have a Republican House. And to put that into even more context, we spent twice as much as we did 10 years ago on a comparable, or 12 years ago on a comparable election. And to put it in even more context, we spent 23 times as much per person as the UK spent on their last general election. So one of the topics we're going to talk about today is how do we start to reinvent this political process? How do we make it more efficient, more responsive to citizens? How do we make it more efficient to resources in our society? And one of the first topics that group of political actors coming together is going to talk about is our budget, which weighs over an awful lot of things. And there's a lot of rhetoric around it, but I started really digging into a lot of the hard data and economic analyses. And there's a lot of divergence over this, right? And if you look at the actual fiscal gap, what the country owes in the aggregate over the next 2 generations, if you brought that back today in dollars, there's some people that say this is a massive problem. This is what the average household in America, in effect, owes $1.7 million with all of the commitments and liabilities that are out there. Some people say, no, it's not a big problem at all. It's only $350,000 that every household owes on all the commitments out there. From my perspective, that's a problem of epic proportions in any range that you might talk about. And I think that's going to have huge implications for a lot of these challenges that we're talking about today. If you look at education, right, fundamental to our success and growth as a country, America has an education system that produces outcomes broadly, if you compare it to other OECD countries, that are about the middle of the pack. Except we spend more per student on education than any country in the world. So we're producing basically mediocre results, but we're spending a tremendous amount of money doing it. And if you look at what that's ultimately been producing for the last generation, you currently right now have a situation where 55% of graduates, recent college graduates, are unemployed or not employed in jobs that are fully using that bachelor's degree, while carrying on average $25,000 in student debt. So how do we look at education? How do we come up with new solutions to how we actually drive learning and educate our children? The same holds true in health, except in health we produce, in a broad sense, despite access to some of the finest doctors in the world and some of the finest medical technology in the world, right? America can give you some of the best medicine that the world can provide. we have a healthcare system in the aggregate that produces essentially bottom of the rank results amongst OECD countries, and we spend 50% more than any other country. And that's a statistic that gets cited a lot, but to really put that into context and think about it, and it's not merely a question of efficiency. There was a great report that came out from McKinsey that really looked into efficacy and pointed out, for example, lots of other countries treat particular conditions wildly better than the US does in a much more efficient way. So for example, France treats lung cancer and lung-related diseases at a rate that's 8 times more effective in terms of death rates and contract rates while providing coverage at 1/3 the cost. And so we need to really look at these models and think about in a really big disruptive way how we drive innovation in health. Energy, 58% of all the energy that's produced in America is wasted through households, factories, transportation, and despite a tremendous amount of effort, only 1.2% of all the energy that's produced comes from alternative sources and renewable sources. So how do we really look at this question of energy efficiency in a distributed way? From a national security standpoint, since the end of the Cold War, another great statistic that I love, over $100 billion has been spent on projects by the Defense Department that were canceled before they ever actually produced any weapon that was used. On the one hand, that's great because it wasn't $200 billion, but on the other hand, there's still this question of how do we drive much better use of funds and how do we drive this? And at the same time, of course, 1 in 4 of our veterans of the most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are unemployed today, right? So we have a lot of these big challenges to tackle. So in a broad sense, the kind of conversation we want to have today is about how do we not look at this from a question of marginal changes or reform, but really look at it from a standpoint of big, crazy, startup-driven, disruptive innovation. And so today's about startups. Today's about looking at some of these amazing startups. Today's talking about how corporations can work with these startups and help support them. Today's talking about how policy can help to drive better outcomes from these startups. And there is no better person to kick us off today for the first programming than Anish Chopra. Anish is the, as I said before, the former Secretary of Technology for the Commonwealth of Virginia. He was the very first ever Chief Technology Officer of the United States of America. He's currently a senior advisor to the advisory company, and he is a candidate for Lieutenant Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So with that, everybody, Anish Chopra.